Namaste, friends. Welcome to another satsang together. As always, we will begin with a piece of music. And today, I'm going to share with you a very special chant, one that is very close to my heart. It's a Bengali chant that Swami Kriyananda used to sing, and it was translated by Yogananda Ji Master into this beautiful English cosmic chant. In English, it is called, "Will that day, O come to me, Ma, when saying, Mother dear, my eyes will flow tears." I'm going to share the Bengali version with you today that Swami Kriyananda used to chant, I'm sure. You can find a recording of him from the internet chanting this. So it's a very, very beautiful devotional chant written by this Bengali mystic poet named Ram Prasad. So I hope you enjoy this. Let's meditate on those beautiful words of the Saint Ram Prasad that Paramhansa Yogananda ji translated for us. This heartfelt yearning, this prayer, will that day come to me, Ma? When I say your name, my eyes will flow tears. Will that day come to me? Om Shanti. Namaste again, friends. Welcome to another evening sharing satsang, discussing this topic of Sanatan Dharma and Hinduism. It's lovely to be sharing these evenings with all of you. Today will be our official last class in this format. On this time, we will move to a different format moving forward, but I look forward to sharing more with you this week. Last week, I had said this, and one of my friends had commented that it would be nice to just hear more stories in these lectures and in these talks. So I'm going to try my best to keep it to stories. I don't have a strong outline on all the stories listed here. I'm sure they will come to me as I'm speaking, and I will try to make this more relevant and make this more fun and engaging by listening to stories of saints and of great souls that can inspire us and draw us upward in our own spiritual journey. So before I jump into the topic for today, I'm going to take on a question which was actually from last week. I didn't have time to answer because I was trying to cover too many things in one talk. This question was also one of the questions that came to me, and I didn't have the chance to address it in last week. So I want to start this week's class with this question. It's a very interesting one. This was the question about whether all the myths and stories that we hear about gods and goddesses and all the things that we hear as stories in Hindu religion, are they all true? Are they all symbolic or allegorical? Is there any truth to it? What part of symbolism should we be looking at every story in the Hindu religion as symbolism? All of mythology, is that what it is? Now, I'm going to try to answer this question. Hopefully this is helpful. I don't want to get too abstract, but we almost go to this core question of what is truth, what is fact, what is history, what is fiction in answering this question, and we have to somehow think outside the box, because this is what we have been discussing about symbols and how we relate to the world, how we understand, how we perceive, how we feel, and what really gives us a glimpse of something that is not of this plane. How can we draw our own awareness, expand our consciousness to realize, to feel, to know things that are not of this plane? And Hindu religion is full of stories, all kinds of stories of different gods and goddesses. And the funny thing is, these stories do not even agree with each other. This is the funny part about Hinduism. I'm calling it funny, but it's not as funny as it's confusing. In fact, any of you who have any familiarity with what I'm talking about totally understand what I'm describing here. Because if you take any other religious faith in the world, there are stories, there are scriptures, and there is versions of what happened, how it happened, whether it's the Genesis in the Bible or the Quran or Judaism and Moses, crossing Egypt and going to the mountains to receive the 10 Commandments. All of these are stories, whether they really happened or not. That's a different question. I'll come to that in a bit. But at least they're not mutually conflicting. Whereas in Hindu religion, you have all kinds of stories. I'm not going to go into all those stories right now. But you have one story where, Vishnu does this and Shiva does something else, and then this god was born, and then this happened after that. And in one story where, Shiva and Parvati have a disagreement, and then something else happens, and Parvati leaves, and Shiva goes and gets her. I'm not necessarily telling you all those stories, but if you were to read or if you were to hear them, it's a mix of mythology, folklore, scripture, and all these just mix so beautifully, and more importantly, just pass through oral traditions most often, that it becomes a little confusing for us. What am I really dealing with here? What really happened? Did Shiva fight with Parvati? How can it happen? They are, supreme souls. They are gods, not just gods. They are reflections of the absolute infinite consciousness. What is really happening here? Is it purely symbolic? Did anything happen? Now, just to talk about the basics, the Hindu religion, Sanatan Dharma in India, divides all of scriptures into two categories. Puranas, not just two categories, there are more. There are Vedas, Vedangas, and all of that. But the two main categories of stories that we deal with, one of them, they're called Puranas, and the other are called Itihasas. I don't need to get into all this theory, but it's important for us only because the Puranas are what we generally call mythology. All the stories of Shiva and Vishnu and Brahma, and what happened, who married who, and then which demon was fought by whom, and what happened after that, all the gods in the heavens, the asuras or the demons that are constantly fighting them. All these are contained in and the Puranas. And then there are itihasas, and there are two major itihasas in the Hindu religion, and the two of them are Mahabharata and Ramayana. Most of you are watching this, even if you are from the West, I'm going to assume that you have at least heard these names, even if you don't know the stories. These are epics. That's the best way to describe them. And the way it is told is that these itihasas are actually historical, that these reflect real incidents that happened. And the Puranas, for the large part, they're allegorical. They're symbolic in nature, but it's not explained in terms of the symbolism. It's not like the scriptures actually go into detail explaining what Shiva represents as a symbol, what Parvati represents, why did this happen in the story, whether these are actually aspects of human consciousness, are these talking about cosmic concepts, what are they really talking about? It is not explained in that level of detail, although it is fair for us to consider all of this allegorical. Now, first talking about what the Indian religion considers history, like Mahabharata or Ramayana, even those, I'm just going to state what Paramahansa Yogananda ji said here, because I don't have any other source or experience to explain or state this in any other way. Yogananda ji said even the story of Mahabharata, it did happen. There was a war of Kurukshetra, there were the Pandava brothers and there were the Kaurava brothers. But the story as it was preserved through history as we read it today is not necessarily accurate historical account. There was a lot of symbolism and allegories and stories and subplots added by Vyasa, who was the author of that book, in order to illustrate spiritual principles, in order to preserve these teachings in the spirit of what happened for future. So even when we look at accounts such as Mahabharata and Ramayana, we have to look at it with those eyes. Now, immediately the rational mind wants to know what part of it is history, what part of it is fiction. Did this happen? Was this character real? Was this a fiction of Vyasa? Now, in my own personal experience, I have not found that way or line of questioning all that helpful. I'm not saying whether anybody should or shouldn't ask those things, but it's not helpful because, again, as I was starting to say, we go to this fundamental question of what is truth, what is fact, what is history, how do humans relate to this world, how do we remember things. If you think about it, our own memory is part fact, part fiction. And part feeling, not fiction, part fact and part feeling. We remember what happened in terms of objective details, but unless and otherwise we actually have an objective notation of the exact way in which things unfold, what we remember, how was your trip, what do you say? We don't start describing the details of each and everything, we just say it was great. The great is a feeling. What we carry, what we present, even as our own recollection, even as our personal history, is generally an account of feeling. Now, facts and truth, in essence, are not the same thing. Facts are simply, it's simply a collection of information that is corroborated by sensory experience, whatever we can see and feel in this world. Truth, on the other hand, is that which is uplifting, is that which is inspiring, is that which is expanding our consciousness, because the purpose of truth itself is that inspiration and that upliftment. Truth is an essence, it's a vibration, it's not a series of facts. Now, I'm not implying that we can say anything and call it truth if we find it uplifting. This is not about pleasing one's ego or somehow making up stuff in order to feel better. That's absolutely not what I'm talking about. But the essence of what truth is always helpful. It is always uplifting. It's always inspiring to the soul. So when we look at whether it's the mythology, whether it's the history, whether it's Mahabharata, Ramayana, whatever scripture we are looking at, that's really what we are working with. We are working with truth, but not in the sense that we usually understand truth as, which is what we have been dealing with all these 4 weeks. We are talking about religion, but not in the traditional sense of what we consider to be a religion. How we conceive and conceptualize these ideas shifts, because the truth that we are talking about is the universal truth, is that vibration of universal understanding that we are all seeking and moving towards. Even something as simple as let's take, sun being worshipped as a god, not just in Hindu tradition, it is common across many traditions. Now, science says sun is a ball of gases. The sun is is it a planet? No, it's a star. I'm sorry. The sun is a star, and we are all planets. Earth and all the other planets in the solar system are being held by sun's gravity, and it's a ball of gases, mostly consisting of hydrogen and helium. It's burning at very, 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 very high temperatures. Now, why would we worship a ball of gas? But again and again, recently I was hearing and listening to this beautiful rendition of a great scriptural verse called Aditya Hridayam, which is an ode to the sun, which is a very spiritual verse. It's a morning prayer that one offers. Now you start to wonder, is this human imagination? Is this human construct? Is this mythology? Why would you personify sun as a god? Now this is where it sort of becomes a little bit of a tricky thing to navigate, because the idea and all the discussion on symbols becomes relevant also in this context, because the sun is a reality, but the sun is also a symbol. The sun, for all that we know, what do we know in science? We know it to be a ball of gases right now, but what about the consciousness that's animating it? I often wonder whether even if sun itself was an evolved being. I think, I'm not exactly sure about this, but in one of Yoganandaji's conversations, somebody asked him a question whether there are beings living on sun, and apparently he just said categorically, of course. I don't know what that means. Certainly not beings as we imagine them, with these bodies that can barely tolerate a temperature range of 20 degrees. We are talking about something of a different kind, of a different plane, maybe not even in this dimension, who knows? So there might be realities about the sun that science cannot perceive. But on the other end of it, it may also be a symbol. It may be a truth that is relevant and useful and uplifting for the soul. Just understanding and relating to that sun outside is in fact reflecting that inner sun. That sun is simply a symbol for that source of light. And as we tune into that source of light, what we realize is, or what we attune ourselves to, is the source of light within. And this connection is what religion provides, is what Sanatan Dharma provides. It's not a question, this question of whether sun is actually a conscious being and is he a god, should I be worshipping sun, is sun the absolute god, is not as helpful or as relevant as the idea that by tuning into the sun, by worshipping God in that form, by seeing that symbol as a doorway to the absolute consciousness, I become in tune with my own soul's essence. I uplift my consciousness and become aware of that inner source of radiance and light that is within me. That is the essence of the Gayatri Mantra. When we say Om Bhur Bhuvaha Swaha Tat Savitur Varenyam, that sun which is pure and the best of all, I worship, I offer myself to that sun. We are, when traditionally in India, when Brahmins perform the ceremonial offering of Gayatri Mantra twice every day, you're facing the sun and offering water as an offering, as a ritual when you chant the Gayatri Mantra. But truly, what you are making the offering to is the sun here, the inner sun, the spiritual I. But you reflect that sun outside, you create that image, and you relate with that image as a way of relating to yourself. And in a sense, all of the scriptures, Ramayana, Mahabharata, which are historical accounts, and all the Puranas, which have stories of Shiva and Parvati and all the other gods, they're all symbolic. It goes back to this discussion of symbols that we have been dwelling on for the past 2 weeks, which is that they're meant to evoke something. They're meant to take us someplace. They're meant to show us glimpses of something that we cannot experience on this plane. Even think of something like fire. The ceremonial offering into fire, of course, is such an integral part of Vedic culture that has been there in India for thousands of years. But it's also followed in many religions. Fire is considered sacred. Fire is considered a symbol of God. But what is fire in reality? If you were to look at facts, anything that is combustible comes in contact with something that is high temperature, and then there is oxidation that happens. And when that happens, there's all these fumes and flames that are just indicating a chemical reaction. You could just put it in scientific terms like that. But it is also reflecting something else, that fire which burns everything, which leaves nothing else but ash, is a symbol of the power of transformation itself. That which we are seeking, the more we tune into it, the more we offer ourselves into the fire. Traditionally in Sanatan Dharma in India, We perform fire ceremony every day. It's called Agnihotra. It is the way we purify ourselves. It is the way we offer ourselves into the light. Now you might wonder, why am I just doing a normal chemical reaction that is pretty self-evident to the eyes, and what's happening here? How does this have any spiritual power? But if you were to look at thousands of years of history, you understand and you experience and see for yourself, this has tremendous spiritual power. It is not just a physical reaction that is happening in front of your eyes. What you are beholding is the power of transformation of spirit itself. In the Vedas, even the deity Durga, who we see as this lady with 8 or 10 hands riding on a lion or a tiger, and who we adore and worship in all these forms, Divine Mother is described in the Rig Veda and in its Suktam, in what is called the Durga Suktam, the verse on Durga, it does not describe her as a lady with 10 hands and riding on a lion or a tiger as we often see it. All those stories and images came much later. It describes Durga as fire. Fire is the form of Divine Mother. Fire is the power of transformation. Fire is that animating force of this universe, not just that physical fire, but this principle that always transforms one thing into another, that makes sure every moment in time is a progression, that things are never fixed, they are constantly changing. That change itself is symbolized by that fire. And when we tune into that physical fire, as we tune in more and more, as we tune into the mantras that are chanted to that fire, suddenly a doorway opens. We see a glimpse of something that is not of the physical plane. We feel that essence within. We feel that spirit of transformation within. So all these symbols are reflecting inner realities in a way, because inner reality is the only reality. That is the only reality that we are working with in any religion, in any spiritual tradition. So even when we explain the universe, even when we explain physical laws, even when we tell stories about different things, this happened, that happened, this was history, and all of this, it all comes back to the inner experience, to the inner reality and our inner life, because that is the one and only purpose of Sanatana Dharma, is to transform, to uplift, to expand that inner reality. So all of these stories, they come back to that one purpose. In fact, when I read that question, the first verse that came to me in my mind was this verse from the Upanishads. The Upanishads are these great Indian scriptures that are part of the Vedas. This is one of the pithy maxims from the Upanishads that's often quoted in Indian philosophy. It says, Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya. Literally translated as, God is the only truth. All of this world is but a myth. Now I was reminded of this verse because that Sanskrit word Jagan Mithya, this world is a myth. It is the same root for that Latin word which later became myth in English, and that's how we are saying the word mythology, which is how the question was phrased. The mythology that we are talking about, the Indian scriptures are telling us, but what do you call untruth? This whole world of senses is untrue. This is a myth. This is a mirage. This world is not what it looks like. Again and again, the mystics and the saints come to tell us that God is the only truth and all of this world is a myth. And here we are. I'm not saying this with any critique or judgment, but here we are where our minds are convinced that this world of material reality, all that we can touch and feel and see and explain with our mind, is the only truth. And somehow, things that come from that higher state of experience, all these scriptures, all these stories, we question, is this allegorical? Is this true? Is this fact? Did this actually happen? What am I dealing with? Now, this is not a bad or a wrong question. It is very sincere questioning that is important on the spiritual path. But also on one level, if you think about it, what is truth? The Indian scriptures start by telling us, the Vedas tell us that all of this world is merely a false image, it's merely a mirage, and the only truth is God. And all these stories, the mythology that we go through over and over again, that's what it leads us to. This is what I was saying in the very first episode of the series when I was quoting Mr. Joseph Campbell, who I adore and I really, really respect his work. There's this 6-part interview series that you can watch on Amazon or any streaming service. Perhaps it's available on DVDs or something. I don't know. It's shot many decades ago, perhaps well before I was born. The title of the series is The Power of Myth, where Campbell talks about mythology and its true purpose. He gives this analogy of the hero's journey and all of that, which I won't go in, but it's beautiful because he not only draws from Sanatan Dharma and traditions of India, but even from Greek, Roman, Egyptian, all kinds of mythology, talking about how we relate to the world, what is truth. We have somehow reduced all of it to mere form, to mere scientific truths that we can experience through the senses, but they are not as helpful to us as we think they are. They do not relate to that feeling reality, which is essentially how we even hold memory. Memory is not based on fact, it is based on feeling. So all of this mythology that Hinduism presents to us leads us back to that one place of understanding that truth, somehow parting the veil so we can see something that is not of this plane. I hope that answer was useful because I am not sure I can directly answer that question, but mythology itself can only be explained in terms of that pithy verse from the Upanishad, which says, this whole world is myth. The whole world is mythology. How can we say the scriptures are mythology? And also, everything is a symbol. Not just things that do not have physical relevance, not just things that are constructed with the mind, not things that we affirm or imagine, but even things that we practically work with on this plane are often symbols, and they have a lot of power, which we have already discussed quite a bit in the first 2 episodes. Now, it actually leads into a good discussion. I know I was going to tell more stories and I'm not getting there. Perhaps I'll start with this story, talking about all these different beliefs and traditions that Hinduism presents for us. We often wonder which one of these are literally true. We look for the literal facts, and even when you go to India, there is this charming naivete about it, of how people take things literally. Shiva came here and he stood there. Rama was here, I can see the Rama's feet on the stone, and if you were a skeptic, you would sort of wonder, I see an imprint on a rock, and even if I calculate historically what year or what time frame Rama lived in, whether an imprint like that can be placed by human feet on a rock, and now, after so many years, will that even survive, erosion and all the other natural processes? Now, you can sort of keep asking that question, but to the believer, to those that have the faith, they are Rama's feet, and they are a symbol as much as they are a reality. And for those that believe, they are nothing else but Rama's feet. Now, it is not to say that it is simply a construction of the mind, but also that symbol in itself is indicating something. Now, I'll tell you a story about this, because this is a story that I heard from somebody. I've never found this online. So if somebody has a more authoritative version of this that is corroborated by other learned scholars, feel free to comment below or wherever you're watching this, and I would love to hear. This is a story of how things are interpreted literally, whereas oftentimes they're indicating energies and symbolism that we cannot understand with the mind. This is a story of a famous Indian astrologer named Varahamihira. I heard this story as a true account. Now, I don't have a way to validate that, so I'm going to share this with you as a true account, unless you tell me otherwise, you have other sources where you've heard this. Varahamihira was a great Indian astrologer who lived during the Gupta period, I believe. I would say perhaps 1,000 years ago. And he was an astronomer and also an astrologer. And he was known to be accurate in his astrological predictions. Now, this goes to the whole topic of whether astrology is real. If you've read the autobiography of a yogi, you know already that it is in fact real, and it's a science, it's an ancient science preserved in India. Now, the Gupta ruler, the king, he had a son, and as soon as the son was born, Varahamihira cast the horoscope for that son, and he said, the son will die at the age of 10, and he will be killed by a wild lion. Now, the king, of course, was not pleased by it. He did not want his son, who was the heir to the throne, to be killed by a wild animal, so he tried his best to disagree with Varahamihira, and Varahamihira simply said, I don't see any other way here. I'm looking at the planets in the sky, I'm looking at the time he was born. There is no other option except that he is going to die at the age of 10, and he is going to die because of a wild animal, a lion, I think that's what he said. So the king vows to disprove Varahamihira because he doesn't want his son to die. So what he does is he builds this beautiful section in his palace where there's a lot of indoor and outdoor area where the son can grow very peacefully. He has everybody, all the teachers, all the friends come to the palace to play with him. No animal is allowed anywhere near the palace. There are guards guarding the palace all the time, day and night, making sure that the son that is sleeping inside this palace is always safe. And the son grows up to be a bright young child, and at the age of 10 he's playing with his friends in the small courtyard area which is surrounded by pillars, and he's having a lot of fun. And suddenly, in the excitement of the game, he goes and hits a pillar. And if you've seen traditional Indian architecture, there are all these figurines of lions and elephants and all of that with their teeth pointing out in these sculpture forms. They are built into the pillars. You can Google, or I'm sure most of you have at least seen pictures of what I'm describing. And what happens is his head hit one of the mouths of the lion that was perching from the pillar like that, and the teeth of the lion of that stone pillar were so sharp that they cracked the skull of that son, and he died right away. Now, I don't know whether that story was true or not, but I think about that in this context because it was not like Varahamihira was saying something false. Of course, if we were to literally interpret everything and try to make facts and try to put all these things together, and we want everything straight, all the ducks in a row, is that what they say? Then we might say he did not accurately get it, because this son, after all, died from an indoor accident. He was not killed by a wild animal in the forest. But at the same time, what he was seeing, what he was perceiving was symbolic of a pattern of energy. And he was reading it a certain way, and that energy was going to manifest in a way that our minds cannot always comprehend. And that's really true with all symbolism, but I thought that's an interesting story to share because, sometimes we get too literal in how we understand religion, how we understand symbols, how we understand these teachings. It's important to understand that these are coming from a place, and we are tuning into energies, we are tuning into principles, we are tuning into vibrations. So it's important for us to come at it with that attitude and with that receptivity. Then we can actually learn, we can actually grow from it. In Hindu religion, they often say a lot of things, growing up. I've heard so many things like, if you go to this temple, it gives you the benefit of going to these 10 other temples. They would say Ganges is the holiest river in all of India. And then they say, in this day of the year, if you take a dip in this well in this small town in South India, you're going to get the benefit of taking a dip in Ganges 1,000 times. And you stand there wondering, does everybody know about it? Then why is everybody going to the Ganges? Shouldn't they be coming to this well here? But there are stories like this about every place, every tradition, every river, every temple, everything. Now you sort of start to wonder, what are they trying to tell us here? Are they just trying to prove that one is better than the other? Different people made up these stories competing with each other? Not so. There is a kernel of truth. Vibrations are true. There are energies, not just in principles and mantras and symbols, energies even in physical objects, even in shrines and holy sites and rivers and all these other places. And they do have a certain power. If we were receptive enough, if we were able enough to tune into them, we would be able to receive that power. Now, they often say that Ganges in the holy town of Varanasi, if you take a holy dip there, you will get rid of all your sins. All your past karma will be expiated if you just went to the Ganges and took the dip once. I don't know who exactly told this, but this is quite a funny one-liner. When a disciple asked a guru, I think this might have been a famous saint, Shivananda, Vivekananda, I don't quite remember right now. If anybody knows, again, let me know. I would love to know, because I'm not sure where this story comes from. The disciple asked the guru, is this true, my guru, that when we take a dip in the Ganges and when we come out, all the sins have been washed away, that we are free of all sins, we are purified just by taking a dip in the Ganges river? And the guru looked at him and said, yes, when you go take a dip in the river, all the sins get out of you and hang on the trees on the banks. And when you come out of the river, they jump back and you will get all of them back. So when you take a dip in the river, you obviously come purified, but then your sins are just waiting in the bank to grab onto you. Now, obviously, it was a joke, but in the sense that It is not just a matter of faith. There is a certain power of vibration and certain power to transform us in all these practices, in these traditions, whether it's a fire ceremony, whether it's taking a holy dip in a river, or whether it's going to a temple or on a pilgrimage. But at the same time, we have to also remember that that receptivity also has to come from us. If we had our hearts so open, if we were so receptive to that vibration that we could be purified by taking a dip in the Ganges, perhaps we will be. Perhaps if we were actually that receptive, we are so close to liberation that that one dip is going to expiate us from all sins, and it can be made true. But at the same time, if we were to hold on to that form without understanding the spirit, that's not going to help us. How many thousands and thousands and thousands of people, millions of people take a dip in the Ganges, not just in its lifetime, but every year, every month, every week, every day? How many people take a dip in the Ganges? Are all of them so completely purified that they are now liberated beings roaming on the streets of India? I'm not sure. Perhaps not. That's what common sense would tell you. But at the same time, there is a certain truth. There is a certain symbolic truth to all these principles that are illustrated to us constantly. I'll share another story. It's related, but it's again about Varanasi. I'm reminded of it because I'm talking about Varanasi and the Ganges. It's a beautiful place. I've been to Varanasi so many times, and every time I take a dip in the Ganges, there's something so deeply uplifting about it. I can barely describe it in words. Now, it's hard for me to believe that all my karma just washed away with the river, I'll be honest with you. But I can certainly tell you, there is this sense of purity that descends on me. And it's not even that the water is pure. It's, if you've been there, I've not been there in the last few years. I'm told that the river has been purified and it's much better now. But every time I've been there, even when it was unclean, the water was not as clean, there was a certain quality to it. There was a certain vibration to it. If I could tune in, I really felt it inside. Now, this other story that I was starting to tell you is about this belief that if you die in the city of Varanasi, that you will be liberated, you will be free, you wouldn't have to take another incarnation. And that's in fact the reason even today, thousands of people who are old, who are disabled, who do not have any means, they just have to get to Varanasi. If they're sick, they'll immediately get to Varanasi so they can die there and they can be liberated. Now, is that actually true? Is that true that if I just die in a place that I will be freed from all my karma? I don't know. See, none of us have been to the other side and are back here talking about this. So we don't have any definitive way of saying, but it seems less likely so. Because if it was true, then all that you'll have to do is pack up your bags and leave and, find a home in Varanasi and settle down there, and you're set for this lifetime. So anyway, the story I was starting to say is there was this person who was a bandit who used to rob people and who did a lot of immoral and adharmic things throughout his life. And at the end of his life, he decides to move to Varanasi because he decided, I've committed a lot of sins in this lifetime. Now I cannot live like this anymore. So I'm going to go to Varanasi and I'm going to die there so that I'll be free and I'll be liberated and I don't have to come back and pay for all my sins. So he goes there. Not only does he go there, this is obviously apocryphal. I don't believe this is a true story, but it's an important lesson. He gets his legs cut because he decides that I should have no option of leaving Varanasi. I'm going to have my legs cut and I'm going to be lame and I'm going to just stay put in Varanasi so that nobody can take me outside of this city and I will die here. So one day, this man who doesn't have legs is just sitting somewhere and watching in the streets, and somebody is riding a horse. It's a beautiful looking horse, and he's thinking to himself, wow, this man really doesn't know how to manage this horse. I could be riding this so much better. And then he keeps watching this man, and he's not as good a horse rider as this other person was, who is now legless. So he keeps thinking to himself, you know what? Even without my legs, I would make a better horse rider than he would on this beautiful horse. If only I could get on top of that horse and show him how well I can do this. And immediately he calls that man. I'd say, I don't even have legs, but I can show you how to ride this horse and I can do it much better than you. He challenges him and somehow finds his way on top of the horse and he starts riding it. And as soon as he does, this horse, which is very active and a dynamic, energetic horse, I don't know what it's called in English. It catches this excitement and it somehow wants to spin out of control and it starts running too fast. And Varanasi is bound by these two rivers, Varuna and Asi, both of which meet the Ganges. And the region between these two rivers is the boundary of the city of Varanasi. So the horse starts speeding up over and over again immediately as soon as it crosses the boundary of one of these rivers, which means it has left the boundary of Varanasi. Immediately it topples this man down and stamps him and kills him there, right across from that boundary of Varanasi, so that he couldn't die there. Now, of course, does that happen with anybody who has sins, that somehow providence will come in there and take them out of the city to leave their body? No. A lot of people die in Varanasi, a lot of animals die in Varanasi, a lot of things happen in Varanasi. I'm not too sure that everybody is completely liberated. It's not because I lack faith, but it's because we want to understand the spirit of all of this. Varanasi itself is such a holy place. In Varanasi, I remember as a child, as I was walking the streets, I remember I was probably 9 years old, 8 years old, I don't remember, but they used to carry corpses on cycles, on bikes, just behind in the seat. It's just this man is riding a bike with his pedals and there's this corpse lying on the bike. And as a child, I was just startled by this image. That's a dead body, because there's so many dead bodies in Varanasi because so many people die there. So there are these funeral pyres that are burning all the time, all day, all night, and sometimes bodies are thrown into the rivers even before fully being burned, because there are so many bodies that are coming in all the time. So death is such a normal thing. There's no stigma around death. There's no anxiety around death. Everybody's just living with death all the time. And as I was watching all of this is not something that came to me at the age of 8 or 9. I was not that spiritually mature at that age. Later on, when I was thinking about it, it came to me, when you're exposed to death in that capacity, when you look at death every day and you have such a casual attitude about it, of course it gives you a certain power to liberate yourself from all ties that bind you at that moment of death. You can in fact free yourself if you were to face that final exam without any attachment, without holding on to that ego, without holding on to any desires. Just see that as one more transition. This body is not me. I am that pure infinite soul that was just inhabiting this vehicle for this limited period of time. Now I am leaving this body and I have the option to also let go of my astral and causal vehicles to be completely liberated. That city, that setting in itself did provide a very good canvas if one wanted to do that. So the statement that says that anybody who dies in Varanasi will be liberated is not entirely untrue. There is a certain truth to that, but you cannot take it factually. Now, of course, we are talking about so many things here. Last week, I even started talking about philosophy and religion and science. I'm going to divert and I'll perhaps go to a few other stories, because I have a whole list of other stories that I made a note. I won't be able to get through all of them this evening. But Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma in itself, is such a sophisticated understanding of the universe, is such a sophisticated understanding of how this world works, that sometimes one is even tempted whether this was just a construct of a very genius mind, that somebody came up with this idea, somebody came up with these principles and scientific truths and found this perfect way to apply them. Sometimes, I would hear things like, why do we do this practice here? Why we... I'm not going to go into all the details here. We put it this way, we put this particular tree outside the house because the breeze from that tree helps you heal from all the disorders that come during summer. Of course, that is a scientific and a very helpful tip. But a religion cannot be reduced, at least Sanatana Dharma, cannot be reduced simply with scientific deductions and common sense based facts or things that are made for convenience on this material plane. You see, that's not the objective of spirituality. Of course, that sophisticated understanding also helps us work better on this plane, come up with ways in which we can do things better, more efficiently on this plane in a way that is scientific and in a way it's grounded here. But that is not the purpose or the objective of religion. The objective of religion is to transcend all these material limitations, to transcend this realm of senses so that we can actually grasp or realize something that is not of this world. That is the true purpose of religion. Oftentimes we are tempted to think that this scientific sophistication that Sanatan Dharma has in its understanding of the universe, in its understanding of reality, perhaps comes from a lot of aptitude in science, and that's somehow of the mind, but it's not. It's of the intuition. There are so many great examples that we have in the Indian tradition, especially from thousands of years ago. We hear all of this. I have read all these in books. I'm not an expert in any of these fields to talk about in detail, but we hear about astronomers like Aryabhatta and Varahamihira who had such precise calculations of the distance between the sun and the planets and all the different celestial bodies of even galaxies so many hundreds of years before even Western science imagined that there were other planets, that somehow, there were other solar systems, that there were other galaxies in this universe. Shushruta, who is considered a great exponent in medicine, thousands of years ago, he is said to have performed surgeries. He is said to have performed complex surgeries, which Western medicine did not attempt to until the 20th century. There are so many examples like that. It is said that the Indians discovered the number 0. I think that is also attributed to Aryabhatta, who was an astronomer, a mathematician, an astrologer, and a lot of other things. So many different examples. The sage Kashyapa, who was a great rishi and sage, he is said to have postulated a lot of atomic theory, which Niels Bohr, who was a great scientist, I believe he won the Nobel Prize, which all came to us as late as the 1950s or 1960s. Kashyapa, I don't know how long ago he lived, hundreds of years before Christ. He is said to have postulated all of these things. Now one wonders, or is all this understanding, how did they find out? Kashyapa did not have an electron microscope. Varahamihira did not have, the most sophisticated telescopes that we have today with which we can observe things with precision. So, there are many people that have many opinions about this. Some people think, they were just saying abstract things and now we are interpreting it as somehow scientific facts and putting our understanding on top of it. Some people feel, they perhaps had advanced technology and they were experimenting and doing all of this. We just don't have proof of all of this here. Now, I'll tell you from the perspective of Sanatan Dharma and the true spiritual understanding of these principles and where all of these great souls come from, none of those are actually true. This understanding of this plane, the physical plane itself, the sophisticated, refined understanding that these ancient sages of India had was from a place of intuitive perception. Their perception was not through a microscope or a telescope. Their perception was by understanding of the inner universe. This is what we even started this whole discussion with, how the inner and the outer universes are reflections of each other. That is simply the principle even behind the science of astrology, because that moment of birth, which is reflecting your first breath, that moment is reflecting your inner universe, and the position of planets and heavenly bodies right at that moment is also reflecting that karmic trajectory that you've embarked on when you took that breath. Now, by plotting and studying this external universe, I can understand that inner universe and the patterns of energy that are meant to be manifesting in that particular incarnation. But all of this just to say that the understanding of Sanatan Dharma, of the material plane of this universe and of all the physical realities, it does not come the way we imagine science to be. We think of science as somehow dissecting things into parts and understanding it by separating it. Whereas Sanatan Dharma, the true spiritual way to understand reality, is always to go inside and to feel and to see, to perceive through our own intuitive eye the inner essence and reality of all things around us. Now, of course, this is such an alien concept because we don't know of anybody today who does all of this. So we don't know that we don't believe that it's possible. But of course, if you were to go back and look at that, the theory of the yugas and what we discussed last week, it'll all make sense because it was in fact a higher age that we were talking about. This also answers another important question that I earlier on alluded to but did not directly address, which is, if all the myths and all the Puranas are in fact allegorical or symbolic, why didn't the sages say so? Why didn't they just not explain the symbolism, just to say, what I'm talking about Shiva and Parvati, but what I'm really talking about is the yin and yang and all these other principles that are inside and these patterns of energy that manifest in the cosmos. Why don't they just say that? Well, the simple reason why they did not say that was because this truth that they were reflecting and presenting through these scriptures is timeless. It is not bound to a space-time context. Our understanding goes through so many shifts. Human understanding right now, I'm speaking to you in 2021, it is so different from what it was in 1921. Can you just imagine? I'm sure none of us watching this were alive in 1921. We just think about it. Wow, what did people think in 1921? They didn't even think that the atom, which is the smallest particle, that they thought the atom was the smallest thing that couldn't be dissected further. They thought that solar system was the only heavenly thing in this, was the only system of planets in this entire universe. Other than that, everything else was stars. I'm not talking about all the other things, even understanding of electricity, of energy, of so many other things. And now I'm talking to you in 2021, although I did not quite study or delve into the depths of all of that science, but it's part of our common understanding. We even know that matter and energy are not fundamentally different, that one can be converted to another, can be transformed into another, and they are the same fundamental reality. I'm saying all of this because, well, going back to the question, I don't want to digress. That is why the sages did not put that symbolism explicitly. That's why we need avatars like Yogananda and teachers like Swami Kriyananda to explain all of this to us through their own inner experience and perception, because they have to tell us in a language, in a way that would make sense to us and that would be relevant for us in the time that we live in. Who knows, maybe 300 years from now, a different avatar will come, or maybe Yogananda will come again and reinterpret the scriptures in a way that will make sense for the refined understanding that humans will have, in 2348. Who knows, in 300 years, 400 years, what to speak of thousands of years. Human understanding and our consciousness, the consciousness of this planet, is constantly evolving. That is why avatars come again and again, where Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Sambhavami yuge yuge, in every yuga I come again. I take visible form. I walk on this physical plane because he needs to, in order to make these teachings relevant, in order to revive dharma, in order to tell us what is right, what is true, what is the key to our own liberation. So that's why the sages just present truth in symbols and leave it to our interpretation. And we have to rely upon mystics and avatars and saints who come behind them to help us, to guide us on a day-to-day basis, to show us the way. Now, going back to what I was saying a little bit before, this idea that the inner and outer universes are reflections of each other. In fact, if you even notice, all these sages that we are talking about, everybody who's anybody in ancient India that we know from history today, whether it's Varahamihira, Aryabhatta, Shushruta, Kashyapa, and even linguists like Panini, Patanjali, who was not just the father of the Yoga Sutras, but he was also a linguist and a great, great scholar in so many other things. In fact, Paramahansa Yogananda, in the autobiography of a yogi, casually says Patanjali was in fact an avatar. He was a truly self-realized being whose only purpose was to establish these true teachings. So all these different people who excelled in different fields were also rishis, were sages. Their primary accomplishment was spiritual. It is even interesting that somehow today we remember all of them for their scientific understanding and whatever they understood and studied of this world and presented as practically helpful, tips and techniques to hack. But in truth, their primary reality or their primary identity was not a doctor or a scientist or an astronomer or a mathematician. Their primary identity was that they were a sage. This person was a rishi. He was an evolved, wise being who was channeling these teachings for the sake of the mankind, who was acting out of compassion in this world. So all these teachers, they tell us, they show us the way. Spirituality is the key. The true understanding that we are seeking can only come from within. I'm not invalidating science or saying that it is not helpful. It has given us the comfortable lives that we live in. But the solutions to all the questions that we are seeking, the fundamental existential questions, they cannot come from the world outside. If we are looking for true answers, we have to go inside, and that's where Sanatana Dharma comes again and again. There is the way of practice. and there's the way of awakening. The way of practice is the way to awaken ourselves, but we also have to understand that they are different. They are not one and the same, because the way of practice is based on forms, is based on all these symbols and traditions and stories and mythology and allegories and all of this that pass through traditions, things that we are told, things that we believe in, things that we hear but we are not sure what to make of it. And all of this is out here. And the way of awakening is that inner reality. And the purpose of all of this is to lead into that awakening. The important thing here, which we keep coming back to in every discussion, is to be able to remember and see that the purpose of all of this is simply that inner reality. And saints and sages come again and again to tell us that same thing. And they show us that this material plane is simply a facade. As I said, Jagan Mithya, they show us that this world is a myth. And that's what even the autobiography of a yogi, with stories over and over again, Yoganandaji explains to us, all these saints and sages who make a mockery of the material plane. The very first cover page of the autobiography of a yogi, I don't have the book with me here right now to show you. When you open the cover page, in the very first page, there is this quote from the Bible. If I can get it right, it says, "Lest ye see signs and miracles, ye shall not believe." And most people, perhaps I'm speaking to disciples and devotees of Yogananda who are already drawn for the spirit and vibrations of his teachings, but most people remember autobiography for all the miracles, for the deathless yogi living in the Himalayas, for that yogi who could fight his tiger with his bare hands, for Larry Marshall who could appear in the wheat field and talk to somebody and not appear on a photograph if he chose not to. So we remember all these things, these signs and miracles. They give us a glimpse, and they are important. We should not be seeking phenomenon and experiences on the spiritual path. That is not the point. But at the same time, as Bible says, as Yoganandaji says, if we don't see signs and miracles, we will not believe. And that's why God shows us. God shows us casually through his saints and mystics who just make a mockery of all the physical laws. So many stories in the autobiography of a yogi. The one that comes to me right now is with Trailanga Swami, who I think he drank a whole large portion of, somebody gave him clabbered milk, but it was actually soda or lime or something that was toxic. And he drank it, and this other person was burning with his stomach in pain. How could he do that? How can physically somebody drink that and somebody else suffer because of it? How is that even possible that he can take it? Now there's another story with Trailanga Swami. I'm not sure this is in the autobiography of a yogi, or maybe it is, but I've read it somewhere where it is said that Trailanga Swami always roamed around naked, and the police did not like it. They considered him a public nuisance because this man was just nude all the time. So they tried to put him in the jail sometimes, and they would find that as soon as they locked him in, he was outside and he was roaming around somewhere. How did he get out? How did he break all those physical barriers and somehow transcend them? There is this other story from the autobiography of a yogi, which I'm sure most of you will remember. The saint is not named, but there's a story told how they're chasing this robber or somebody who did something bad, and they find this holy man, the sadhu, who they mistake to be this person they're chasing. Immediately they take the sadhu and they cut off his hands, and this man is just bleeding out of his hands. And as Yoganandaji tells the story, all that he did was he just calmly takes his hands and puts it back, and his hand attaches to the body, and he says, I'm not the person you're looking for. The person you're looking for went this way. How do they do that? How does this happen? Now, these are all stories, of course, that are hearsay, but oftentimes we even have experiences on our own life. Maybe not as dramatic as that. I remember, many, many years ago, I won't go into all the stories. I'm sure all of you have stories from your own life of having things that somehow transcend just our experience of senses and what we believe to be the physical reality. I remember I met somebody high up in the Himalayas. This was over for 15,000 feet. I was on a backpacking trip. And this was a holy man. And he was casually telling me that he goes, he stays there during winter. And I had my Sherpas and porters who were carrying my luggage, and they were all telling me, I did not believe when they told me that, this man, when it gets snowed down at 15,000 feet, which is probably 4 or 5 months a year, he just goes into his hut, he goes in there, he closes the door, and he just stays there throughout the period of winter, and he doesn't come out. And they even said, we supply him some food, but it's not a whole lot of food, and he stores all of it down there and he stays there. He doesn't come anywhere to the lower altitudes. He prefers to stay here. And I was sitting here at 15,000 feet altitude looking at these peaks that are so high. I was just in a different plane, and I was talking to this man. Is that true that you actually stay here in winter? And he said, yeah. I just, I go in there, I just do my puja, and he had this beautiful image of Durga in that temple, and I even went into his cave to see what all he had there. In fact, later on, this is just a tangent, a reporter in India caught wind of the story that I met this man who he had heard about, and I had pictures of this saint, and he wanted pictures, and I gave him pictures, and he made a news article about it in some famous Indian daily. But that's irrelevant to the story. I was just wanted to share this, because that's how I remember all of this. And I was chatting with this holy man, and I was asking him, is it true that you actually go under the snow and you live there? I don't think you'll have oxygen. How do you survive? Or, what do you do? And he just says, he was very casual in his responses. He was not trying to be pretentious or somehow sound like this, great holy man who had achieved something. He was very, very down to earth. He made me lunch and he gave me chai, and he was just so friendly. And then I asked him one question, why do you choose to live here? What is it that you do? And then he gleefully smiled like a child, and he took me inside, and he had this long, very, very old telescope. It's obviously not a very sophisticated model or anything. It's just this one preliminary telescope which had a bunch of mirrors inside. And he said, I live here because I like to look at the stars, and I have the best view from this point. And I thought to myself, that cannot be the only reason he lives there, is to look at the stars. But anyway, I share these stories because sometimes we have experiences in our own life where this veil of Maya just splits open, and we are beholding an experience that tells us that there is something on this plane that we don't fully understand. There's this other story of Neem Karoli Baba that perhaps many of you have heard about. Neem Karoli Baba was a great, great saint who lived in India, and his famous disciple is a Western man named Ramdas, who became very popular and who was also a wonderful teacher. And Ramdas talks about his story of first meeting Neem Karoli Baba, who was his guru. At this point, he did not know that this man was his guru, the saint. So Ramdas used to experiment with consciousness. He was a researcher here in Palo Alto, where I live, and he had a group of friends, and they used to try psychedelic drugs, LSDs and all those things. And they used to go into these altered states of consciousness, questioning what consciousness itself is. What is the mind? What makes reality? What is sensory experience? And they were so curious. They wanted the truth, and they were going into these altered states all the time, chemically infusing it, somehow putting your brain in those states. And Ramdas himself was a researcher, so he exactly knew what chemicals did what in the brain and what was happening when he was taking them and why he felt the way he did. And when he met Neem Karoli Baba, he had carried some LSD with him. I don't know whether he was regularly taking them or not. I have no idea. And Neem Karoli Baba asks him, what is it that you have? And he gives a few pills. He shows Neem Karoli Baba, this is, these are just pills, these are LSDs. I don't know how he explained it in Hindi or what the translator said. And Neem Karoli Baba, can I have some? And Ramdas said, you cannot have more than half. That is the most one can take. You will die. Your brain will just completely go berserk, and you can't relate to this world at all. You'll just leave your body if you took too many of these, or you'll just suffer so much. And Neem Karoli Baba takes all of it, I don't know how many other pills he had, and he just pops all of those in his mouth. And he just looked at Ramdas, and Ramdas was looking at him. Something terrible is going to happen right now, because he just overdosed himself in the most dangerous of chemical substances, and maybe he had to run to the hospital. And Neem Karoli Baba was sitting there with clear eyes, just looking into Ramdas as if nothing had happened. And immediately Ramdas knew that his name at that time was Richard Alpert. He knew that this was not an ordinary man, that this was a reality that he had never experienced. This man was making a mockery of this material plane itself. And that's what Yogananda ji again explains over and over, even in the autobiography of Yogi. There's this whole chapter called Law of Miracles, that story of how, there's this almost sweet, innocent story of the cauliflower robbery where, Yoganandaji and Yukteswar walk on the beach, and then there's this robber who runs into the ashram and takes just one or two cauliflowers while all of the other wealthy possessions are just lying out there, and he just needed to prove to Yogananda that he shouldn't be careless. Now, how do you explain any of that? Did Yukteswar know that the robber was coming? Did Yukteswar actually influence somebody's thoughts to make that happen? What was happening how? And how did Yogananda, why did Yogananda not know if he himself was a self-realized being? You really cannot answer all of these questions with a straight mind, because even this whole idea of linear time, of space and causality, all of these, they don't hold as much relevance. They don't hold themselves together in the light of truth that is so timeless and that's beyond all the space-time constructs of the mind. And again, in Sanatan Dharma, that's why we go back to that first class that we all shared, where we were talking about saints and mystics being the custodians of religion. And this is the reason why, not just for miracles and signs to prove to us that this physical plane is not real, but they have that power. Mystics have that power, saints have that power, because they have experienced something that is not of this plane. So when they walk in here with us, when they walk with us, I'm talking here about all these people that I've actually not met in person, except of course the sadhu that I met in the Himalayas. But we also have sometimes teachers amongst our own midst. I have even people in my own life, people that did not defy physical laws, but by all practical measures, who demonstrated resilience, who demonstrated a certain spiritual capacity that I find to be extraordinary, who are an inspiration for me. And my own teacher, Swami Kriyananda, who exemplified discipleship through his lifelong desire to serve his guru. So many things he did. I cannot get into it. We are almost at the end of our time here. We are beyond the end of our time here, so I'm not going to get into it. But Swamiji used to go to dentist without Novocaine and have dental treatments done. When he had his hip replacements, his anesthesia wore out, and the surgeon was shocked at the end of it to know that this man was actually operating on somebody without anesthesia, because the surgeon would have been so uncomfortable. How could he do that? How is it physically possible for your nervous system to be drawn in so much that you can suppress those natural instincts of even pain? How was that possible? How could Swamiji, who I actually met in person, who I remember seeing in body and shaking his hands and receiving his blessing, how could he be so out of the ordinary? But he just looks like me. He just looks like a person that normally walks with us. And that is the power that the saints the saints have. That is the power they bring to all of us. Lest ye see signs and miracles, ye shall not believe. Swami was never ostentatious. He never displayed any miracles or defied physical laws openly in front of us. But there was something so extraordinary about him. I, of course, did not have a personal relationship or watch him, like many others did. Even people of my age, they might have had a lot of personal interaction with Swami, because he lived until the year 2013. My interactions with him were very brief, either in a talk or in passing or receiving a blessing. But I know all those stories to be true, and even with my very little experience of being in his company, I believe them to be true. It's not a mental idea or an affirmation. I just know them to be true because I know who he was. So I'm ending on this note. I did not realize I was going to go here, but somehow we are here talking about Swami and Yogananda. But that really is the essence of Sanatan Dharma. The only way to understand Hinduism or any religion or any spiritual teachings is to tune in to the avatars, to the saints, to the mystics, to be able to touch their consciousness, to constantly attune to their vibration. And that is the way we understand these truths. That's the way we understand these principles. And that is the purpose of Sanatan Dharma itself. It is not to create all these foolproof rituals that will somehow lead you to liberation, the right river to take a dip in, the right temples to visit, the right rituals to perform, at the end of all of which you will somehow be freed and you'll be happily liberated through eternity. That's not how it works. all of these symbols, all of these practices, all of these have been given to us so we can attune to that vibration, so we can tune in. And the real attunement that we need is not even to all the places and the things and all these other practices. It is to the living examples. It is to the living examples of the vibrations that are carried through the mystics and saints. Let's seek them, let's find them. And if you find somebody like Yogananda through his vibration, through the autobiography of a yogi, hold on to it so tight that this now can become your key to salvation, that this vibration that you have experienced, even just by reading autobiography of a yogi. Nobody watching this video, I'm going to assume, has ever seen Yogananda in person. But if you read the autobiography of a yogi, you get to taste his vibration, you get to feel it, you know the truth there. It is not about the facts. Of course, everything that he states in the book, I'm sure, are facts. But still, it is not a collection of facts, or it's not a journal of information. It is truth itself presented by an avatar that is worth tuning into. So friends, that is a really high note to end this class on. Last week I mentioned that this is going to be our last class, and I'm not going to be continuing giving these satsangs on Wednesday evenings. I was saying that perhaps we will continue this in a smaller setting, perhaps in Zoom, or some way we can all come together. I still am hoping and wanting to do that, but the next step for how we are going to hold this is in the link. I've already copied today a web page where you can have a description for this class series. If you're interested, just put in your name there. I'm planning to continue offering this course on a platform called Mighty Networks. We are experimenting with it, and Ananda Palo Alto is going to be moving there. So I'm going to offer this course not on live stream or any other platform, but on Mighty Networks, where I'll be sharing videos regularly. I'll share more information with you on how I plan to do that. And there in that course, if you sign up, then we'll also have opportunities to meet. There'll be a charge associated with that, but I know many of you are in different countries, so don't worry about it. If you're from India or somewhere else, if you fill in your name there, the charge is suggested, and you're very welcome to make a donation, or if not, that is okay too. Everybody is welcome to join the Mighty Network side. I invite you to join and tune into this course, because I'll be continuing teaching there. I'm going to say I'm afraid it might take perhaps 2 or 3 weeks for me to set it all up before it's available, and I will be sharing videos on a regular cadence. And also we'll have discussion forums where we can share each other's thoughts, and perhaps we'll also have Zoom meetings where we can come together and discuss some of these things. We will see. I'm not sure if all the time zones will match and whether there are enough people interested in doing that sort of thing, but if there is, I'm happy to find a time that works for our calendar and for everybody to be able to have some sort of a satsang like that. We will see where it goes, but for right now, this is ending only in this format. We will continue this discussion. Swami's book is so rich. There's a lot of teachings to explore, and I hope you will join me in this journey and continue traveling with me as we explore Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma. And thanks for all your comments and feedback so far. Feel free to write to me, and I love hearing from you. I'll see you soon in this series or a different class somewhere, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch. God bless you.